Hello, in this video I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to use the Decal King asset from the asset store, which is an asset for projecting an image onto a surface. And in this tutorial I'm going to first show you how to simply create a decal period, and then I'm going to go through all of the advanced options that the script offers. So to start out with, I'm going to go into the prefab folder, and you can see that there are 3 prefabs, and I'm going to grab the constant decal forward script and drag it into the hierarchy. Now this is simply a pre-built object that includes the script, and unlike if you use the script on its own, this one comes with this little arrow that will make it much easier to see what's going on in the scene view. So this one projects the image along the line, and it will default to an orange circle, which is a targeting indicator, is the idea for a game. It would be like showing where an attack would go. And so we're going to just turn this down so it faces the ground, hit play, and here we have the image. So all that needs to be done after this is you need to grab the material you want, and in this case I'm going to use some materials that are included in the asset itself. So you go, in this case I will grab King Decal. And so for now, let's just focus on possible decals. So here it has a size of 1 because it's a list, and there is the material that I've chosen. And the material is anything that works on a 3D object. So like, for example, you could theoretically apply this material from this concrete area. It wouldn't look good, but you could do it. And so now you can see that it's applying the King logo. But you can set this to a number greater than 1 and drag in other materials. And it will randomly select one when it first creates the decal. So if you see, if I just hit play repeatedly, or actually if I just turn the script on and off, it will swap at random between them. And this could be used, for example, if you are using the script with a gun and creates bullet holes on the wall. You could have more than one bullet hole and pick between them. So that's the most basic way to get a decal into your scene using Decal King. Now we're going to go through the options. So there's the mode, and we're going to come back to mode in a second, but basically if you're using constant decal or stationary decal, you only have to worry about decal mesh options, possible decals, and raycasting options. You do not have to worry about decal caster options. So just ignore this unless you're in this mode, and I will explain that mode in a bit. But for now we're going to go into this, and so these are just the basic parameters that define how the mesh is created. So what this asset is doing is it's creating a mesh and then shaping that mesh to match the surface underneath using physics raycast against a collider. And so you can see that if you move this, I mean, you can't really see it in the shadow just because of how the light works. But for example, if you wanted to put it against this curve back here. Again, you can't really see it because of the lighting, but you can see that it bends around with the curve. And so in order to do that, it needs to have a mesh with quite a few vertices, because it's aligning the vertices with the collider. And so, but having more vertices increases the performance cost. So on a flat surface, you can create a decal with just 4 vertices, 2x2, using these 2 options. And you see it looks exactly the same, the texture is the same resolution, everything's fine, but it only has 2, well, it only has 4 vertices, so its ability to align to surfaces is limited. And here you can see it really doesn't react well to being placed against this. It just doesn't work at all. Occasionally it'll display, but it's just flat, and I'm sure it's clipping if you can see it. So something 12 by 12 is a reasonable value. That is the default. So if you aren't having any performance problems and it seems to be aligning the surface fine, I would just leave it on that. If it's clipping through the surface, I would increase these numbers, and if you're on a flat surface, I would reduce them. The next thing is decal width and decal height, which, unless you're trying to go for something specific, should be the same value. And these are just the width and height of the mesh if it were completely square in unity distance units. So here you can see I've set it to 10 by 10. And it's 10 by 10. If I wanted, I could set it to 10 by 100. But it wouldn't look very good. And you can see this doesn't update because it doesn't recreate the mesh every frame. That would be extremely inefficient. So next we have the rotation options. Oh, well, by the way, just to piggyback off that, if you want it to reset during the scene, just do that. Anyway, so these 2 options for the rotation, if randomized rotation isn't checked, it doesn't matter what's down here. Nothing will happen. It'll just always be set to the default. And if you click this with the default setting of 0 through 360, it will randomly select the rotation. And so now we have our final 2 options. Max variance is essentially, so we talked about how the mesh is made up of vertices. Well, every mesh is also made out of triangles, and max variance is how far apart essentially the vertices in a triangle can be along the cast direction, which I'll explain what that is in a bit. How far apart they can be, and if they go further than that apart, it doesn't render them. And so you can disable this by setting it to 0 or to a negative number. But what you get is okay, there. What you'll get is this ugly stretching, which might be what you want, but if it isn't what you want, you can change this to a non-zero number, and here you see that it won't generate those ugly stretched parts. And when I say ugly stretched parts, imagine like if this were up here and it was like 3 times as long, just how bad it would look. That's why max variance is an option. And then finally we have this Boolean value, which is lock plane. And so normally the decal just matches the surface it's placed against, so it just goes out. But if you hit lock plane, it will instead orient itself to go back towards the game object that is sending out the decal. And so there are reasons why it's not displaying, which relate to these options that we're going to get to in a second. But you can see how it kind of stretches. That's because it's trying to face back towards decal, the game object that has the create decal mesh script on it. Okay, so done 1 out of 3. Now we go on to ray casting options. These are more advanced options that can generally just be ignored unless you're going for something specific or something is going wrong. Most of the options in this are like that. They can be pretty safely ignored if you don't need anything specific to happen. But anyway, so for the ray casting options, we have layers to cast against, which is just a layer mask, and by default the decal ray will be allowed to collide with anything except for the ignore ray cast layer, but you can do any combination. You see when I turn off default, suddenly it just can't find anywhere to put the decal. Alright, now you have ray cast against triggers. Basically, since triggers are normally on colliders that are invisible, it doesn't make any sense to try to put a decal on them, so by default, regardless of layer, the script just ignores triggers. You can turn that off if for some reason you want it to and have it collide with triggers. Next we have initial raycast distance. And if we jump ahead a bit down to debug cast direction, you see how there's these lines in the editor? That's because of this. You need to have gizmos on to see them, and the white line is the initial cast distance. And that's how far it will look to try to find somewhere to put the decal. And so if we make that a much smaller number, you can see that it can't find a place to place the decal. Now we're going to yet again jump forward to this variable, unplaced triangle mode. So far it's been on remove triangle, so if for whatever reason it can't find a place to put vertices down, normally it will just not show that triangle. However, you also have the option of not showing the entire decal, which is generally not what you want, but it yeah, here you can see it does save on performance, because when it realizes one triangle can't be drawn, it just gives up on drawing the whole decal. So there might be some situations where that would be desirable. But for now, we're going to look at these options: hover at up distance, hover at mid distance, down, and max. And for now, we're just going to look at mid, since that's probably the most desirable anyway. And so going back to where we were, hover if initial raycast fails. So I was talking about what happens if the initial raycast simply doesn't find anything. Well, normally it just doesn't make the decal, but you can have it make the decal in mid-air, in theory. Oh wait, we have to check that. Yeah. Okay, if we have to set this to a low value, we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, here you can see that it just appears in midair, and this is a weird use case. You'd probably be more likely trying to use it for something like this, where a decal exists both on and off of the ground. Sorry, I have to mess with these, but I'll explain what I'm doing with max range and mid range in a second. Yeah, something like that. So if, for example, you had like a crosshair or something that really needs to display, this would give you the option of displaying it against the air or against a collider. So now we're going to go down to the two options that are probably most likely to break your decal. And to show them off a little more simply, I'm just going to go back to go back to a 4x4 size decal. because we're going to be in some tighter spaces. So you can see the red line and the green line. So when the decal finds the initial placement point, which is where the red, white, and green lines meet, it will go this far up and this far down trying to place vertices. Otherwise it will just give up and do whatever the unplaced triangle mode option is. So you can see if we set these to extraordinarily small values, and then we try to you're trying to use keyboard shortcuts while I think selected, and then you try to place it against a curved surface. Let's go over to the lit side. Okay, this script is apparently just defying me by working regardless. Oh yeah, I have to hit remove triangle to make this point. So you can see that a part is kind of shaved off. That is because I've given it such a small range to work with that even with this relatively light curve, it's not allowed to go down far enough to place the entire decal. And that's the main way that decal min range and decal max range can mess up your decal and prevent it from working. But there is another way, which is so the red line, decal min range, that the end of the red line is the first place that it will check to try to place the decal, and it'll send the raycast down. So the first thing it hits along the red line and then along the green line is where it places it. Now, let's set decal min range to a very high value to make a point, which is, let's say you place your decal, but along the red line there's a collider. It will not place it in the correct area, but instead place it in the top area, which is why it's important that decal min range be set fairly low, even though decal max range can be pretty high. So finally we've gotten to height offset. Height offset is essentially if you were to just, if you were to place it against the surface, just on top of the collider, in theory at least, it should just not display. Apparently you have to set it to a slightly negative number, but I wouldn't trust that. So generally what you do is you just set a small height offset and it'll just place the decal invisibly higher, but enough for Unity to know that it needs to display this first and the ground second, or the wall, or whatever other surface. So if you want to place the decal on a rough surface without showing that it can't actually be placed there, so for example you see, let's go back to our 2x2 decal, you can see Unity just can't figure out how to place it because there's no way to place 4 vertices that meets our conditions. Let's see, so let's turn off max variance. Should be placing something. Maybe that's too small. So here, So here you can see it kind of awkwardly stretching. Well, what you can do is you can set a height offset that is really big. And now, and this is a intentionally very extreme example, but now we have a 4 vertex decal that is in fact displaying against a curved surface. Of course, if your user sees it from the side, what they will see is that it is hovering, which is obviously not desirable. So in general, this should only be used for decals that are along the camera. And I know I've been using my 2x2 and 4x4 decals a lot, but that's just to make a point. That's not a good idea. Okay, let's set these back to sane values. Oh yeah, this would be the problem. 0.1. Set a max variance, lower. Yeah, so now it's back to working. Alright, and so finally, cast direction. Cast direction is for these prefabs very simple, not just because of the arrow, but because 2 of them default to That's interesting. Alright. I think I've been creating and recreating that decal too many times. Yeah. Anyway. So they just default to forward, and because local cast direction is checked, cast direction is figured out in local space. So I can turn this object and the cast direction will turn. On the other hand, constant decal down if it ever needs to move. Where did it place that? Okay, placed it at y equals 300. That seems wrong. Yeah, okay. So this one is in world space by default, and so you can see that no amount of rotating actually changes the direction. In general though, you can just set it to local cast direction and forward. And it'll just work. I messed up the arrow here, but the point is, in general, this is all you should need. Oh, I didn't mess up the arrow. It's rotated to point down. Yeah. So that is decal mesh options and raycasting options. Now let's get to the final point, which is the alternate modes. So stationary decal is real simple. It's exactly the same as constant decal, but constant decals are expensive because they have to align every single frame. Stationary decals only align once, so they will not change no matter where you put them, because they're not meant to move. That's stationary decal. If I put this over here against a curved surface, like say, let's aim this back here. Alright, that one has its min decal range set too high. But anyway, you can see no matter what I do with it, it just keeps that weird shape because that's where it was cast. Now, the bad news is that you can't move them, obviously, but the good news is they have no performance impact after the first frame. the first frame they're created, because they're just a static mesh after that. They don't do anything whatsoever. So generally those are better for most purposes. Constant decal you should use carefully and only when you need it. Now, the final option, or the final mode, is decal caster option. And all of these use the same script, by the way. You can modify the script to make any of these manually, and you can modify any of these into whatever you want. So if we change this to decal caster, it won't make a mesh at all. Because it is now doing something different, which it has become an object that makes new stationary decals. So we were talking about the gun that makes bullet holes before. You would achieve that effect with a decal caster. And the only really big thing to remember here is that there has to be some kind of automatic trigger, which is generally a key. So here I've set it to mouse 1 under custom input and button down under button trigger condition. Auto trigger interval is how often it can go off, and we'll get to special auto trigger in a second. But here you can see if I click in scene view, it makes our decal. And it can just make as many as it wants. And now we have two other options. So constant and object disabled are both what they sound like. Constant just ignores all conditions, and it would do every 0.5 seconds it would make a new decal. Object disabled is if this object is disabled, it casts one decal, and so that would be most likely something like you have a scorch mark appear when an object, like when a bomb blows up. Placement range and distance from placement point are about the same as min decal range and initial raycast distance from before. So it will look 300 units to find a point, and then when it finds that point, it'll back up 10 units along that ray, and that's where it places it. And so here you can see the white line is how far it's looking to find the point. The yellow line is how far it backs up. So the game object for the decal will be placed here, which is honestly a bit high, so let's lower it a bunch. And the light blue line is which way the decal will be facing. Now, this decal caster mode uses these two options, but it just uses them for the meshes it creates rather than itself. So if we go here and hit lock plane, you can see that that light blue line goes away. Now the game objects created will still use lock plane unless I go down here and click that on and off. So this causes the decal caster to update its settings, but it has a performance cost, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend using it. But for testing purposes, it's helpful. And so here you can see it's going that way. And like I said before, if lock plane is off, it just tries to face back towards the caster. So you can see it's getting a little more stretched every time. That's because with lock plane is true. It makes it so that if your camera is right where the decal is cast, it'll look in general. Again, this one has the default settings. It's perfect for this object. I could make that look a lot better by messing with these settings. But anyway, if it's right there, you see how it just makes the decal look like it's normal size, but from any other perspective, it looks quite stretched and weird. So anyway, so we've gone through the trigger conditions and these, placement range and that. So now we get to the last thing, which is what happens to the decals after they're created. So parent cast decals to collider is by default on, and what it means is that it's what it sounds like. So it found this thing's collider, this concrete area, so it parented the decals to this. Now this thing move. Okay, apparently... Oh, I see what happens. Apparently the collider is parented to the concrete ring, because this thing isn't supposed to move. But anyway, if this were all one game object, and it were parented to it, if in theory they should all move with the terrain. I mean, they're moving with the terrain here, it's just the terrain seems to be only a part. Oh, I think I know what's happened. The concrete stuff has been marked as static. That's why it won't let me move it. It's because it's meant to be stationary terrain. Duh. But anyway. So in general, there's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't want to parent cast decals to Collider, because by default it does actually change their scale, so even though they're made children, it will look the same. So like this could be something like, oh yeah, no, look, scale is 115, but this thing looks like it's the right size. So I would just leave parent cast decals to Collider on, but if you have a reason to, if you're going for something specific, again, the option is there. And now, how do you get rid of decals? Well, by default, you don't. They will just stay there forever. But there's two options for getting rid of them. Limit spawns will limit how many can exist at once. And past then, it will start moving the old ones and recreating them in the right shape in the destination. So you can see they still align to the surface, but they are being... These really could use max variance being set. I must have given these some weird settings. What did I leave this on? Well, anyway. So that is an option for limiting spawns, and you can also just have them despawn in a set amount of time, which I don't believe will apply to newly cast decals, but here you can see after 3 seconds they disappear. In general, I wouldn't recommend 3 seconds. I would recommend something like 30 or maybe like 15, because things don't generally disappear in 3 seconds in real life, and it might be kind of immersion breaking. So anyway, that is every single setting. Again, most of this you can just drag the prefab, the constant or stationary decal, forward prefab in. The arrow will tell you where you're placing things. And you don't really need to delve into this unless you're going for something specific or something more advanced, like the decal caster. So anyway, hopefully that has been informative. Thank you for watching this tutorial through to the end. And have fun with the asset.